in the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
And those are the immortal words of Alabama Governor George Wallace. I'm Dodge Landisman, and today we'll be talking about the 1964 Democratic presidential primary campaign. I figured I'd bring this up because the candidacy of Robert F. Kennedy has been particularly interesting to me. Right now, he's only polling at 10 to 20%, but even if a candidate makes a dent against an incumbent president in the party primary, the entire viewpoint, the entire political system could change forever because of one campaign, because of one man. That certainly happened in the little-regarded campaign of George Wallace. In his first campaign, he subsequently ran for president in 1968 as an independent, as well as in the Democratic primary, more famously in 1972, as well as 1976. But the 64 race is one that has gotten the least amount of attention and least amount of notoriety, even though it certainly should. 1963, Governor George Wallace stands in the doorway trying to prevent the passage, blocking the passage of two black students trying to enter the University of Alabama. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy made sure to enforce the law and put his foot down when it came to civil rights.
Kids carrying anti-Kennedy signs appeared in front of the Capitol before the Attorney General arrived. The signs read, "Mississippi murderer, Kennedy, Kosher, and Khrushchev, Washington, D.C., a disgrace to white people." The pickets refused to obey police orders to leave and were arrested. Two resisted. Police overpowered them and forcibly put them in a paddy wagon. All of this activity about 15 minutes before the Attorney General arrived.
This country means anything, if our society is going to hang together at all, it's going to hang together because of law and observance of the law. And that's what we are interested in. This transcends the question of segregation or integration or desegregation. This is a question of law and order in the United States, number one, and number two, upholding the law of the United States.
And it was at that moment where Wallace realized he could make himself a national figure. He had lost in a close race in 1958. He was previously a state Supreme Court judge. And at that time, he was actually more progressive on civil rights than his opponent, James Patterson, was. Patterson was an interesting guy unto himself. His father got assassinated trying to break up the mafia. So an interesting story of Patterson as well. But he lost to Patterson, and he said he'd never be out. I'm not going to say the word, but it's the N-bombed. He'll never be out N-bombed again. And in 1962, he decided to campaign decidedly further to the right and decidedly against integration. And it worked. He won the election in January of 1963. He was inaugurated. So Wallace had only been in office for a handful of months when he stood in that doorway in the University of Alabama. After Wallace became essentially famous across the nation, he figured he may very well give President John F. Kennedy a run for his money in the Democratic primary. Wallace had realized that the Democratic Party, had shifted dramatically, even within the last 10 years. Previously, Democrats were considered by far the most pro-segregation party in the U.S., but there had been a number of Democrats who decided to tack decidedly left and decide to be pro-civil rights. Kennedy had accelerated Eisenhower's mildly supportive civil rights stance and sort of kicked it into overdrive, continuing the enforcement of all these federal governmental decrees. Eisenhower started it quite heroically in 1957 with Little Rock. But at that time, Wallace felt like the voice of the pro-segregationist people in the South, who felt that they were losing their region and losing their country to all these integration policies, he felt like they didn't have a voice. So Wallace would begin to accumulate and build up national press and become a national figure. So we're looking at fall of 1963. Keep in mind, Kennedy is only about a month away from getting assassinated. But Wallace already has this plan to run in the Democratic primary. He received over 100,000 letters in support of his actions. Interestingly enough, half of those were from people in the North. Now, only about 1.5 million at this point, people would vote in the Democratic primary. So if he had 100,000 letters of support, you can multiply those letters, people choosing not to write, you can multiply that by 3 or 4, and hey, you might have 40 to 50% of the Democratic primary vote. And the first thing he did is he wanted to meet as much controversy as he possibly could. This is interesting to follow because you could really see how careful and curated and planned out every political action that Wallace took was. He was Trump before there was Trump. He was novel in this idea of stirring up controversy and attention seemingly out of thin air and using it to bolster your own political profile. Wallace was one of those early candidates, early politicians, even before Richard Nixon, to realize that division sells in American politics. And boy, was Wallace good at that, to say the least. So he started off his tour going into the Lion's Den, which was Harvard University in Boston, Massachusetts. Of course, at Harvard, you would think you would only be met with very progressive pro-civil rights students. So Harvard Crimson has an interesting bit, and it's interesting to look at the dialogue and the discussions being discussed in 1963 because there's so much that's similar to what's happening today in 2023. That's not always the case in the 80s and the 70s and the 90s. The political rhetoric was certainly more muted, but there are a dramatic number of parallels looking at today and then looking at 1963. So we'll see what the Harvard Crimson wrote in anticipation of his big upcoming speech to the students over there. It certainly was controversial. We are curious to see how Wallace behaves at Harvard, in contrast to his hollow haranguing before Alabama schools. It may give insight into a man who, whether we like it or not, represents an important political faction in this country. Key words. And I'm quoting somebody, so I'll use a certain word, but I'm quoting the history of the time. From the Harvard Crimson, I quote, Mel King, Negro candidate for school committee, feels Wallace's speech might sharpen contrast between freedom in the North to oppression in the South to the Negro's advantage. Meaning, what this Mel King was trying to say is let them all talk. Give these candidates a platform. Again, so familiar. You look at Alex Jones with Twitter. Do you let him stay on Twitter? Do you let Trump stay on Twitter? Well, some would argue, let these guys hang themselves and continue to support the freedom of speech. And you could hear the people sounding crazy, and it might actually work to your advantage. So in this, a young man asks George Wallace a question. He says to Wallace, if he's against slavery, how could he justify his ardent support of segregation when he brought black people over here in the first place? So there's a little bit of a combat, a light combat between them. And I kind of like imitating Wallace's accent. I'm not going to imitate everybody's accent, but Wallace is so distinctive. He says, what country are you from? Because this black gentleman, is a student at Harvard. And there were a fair amount of students in white colleges back then. You might be surprised to learn that. When you really study history, the reality might surprise you. The North is more racist than you think, but there was still significantly more black advancement, even in the 1950s and early 60s, than you might think. I believe college attendance black college attendance at White College had risen from 2% in 1950 to 6% in 1963. So a significant number. There were serious inroads, even back in the 50s, being made. So this young African-American man, he had this British accent, so he asked the question to Wallace. Wallace said, what country are you from? And he said, Ethiopia. And he said, well, you people have slavery there. And then this young man retorted, quite tactfully, slavery is punishable by death in Ethiopia. And kind of got Wallace to be silent. That was a very good retort. And then another young African-American student stood up and proclaimed something to Wallace. And this African-American student, Gregory Du Bois, the grandson of W.E.B. Du Bois, interestingly enough, he said that he was going to run for president. He had that confidence in himself, which is pretty cool considering this is the fall of 1963. But again, advancement wasn't as a radical idea for black people as you might think back then. So he says he wants to run for president. And interesting enough, this is part of the Wallace strategy. He caters to his audience. And what he's really good at, and what some people say Trump might be really good at, is being famous for this outlandish rhetoric, but then in specific instances, seem really friendly and conciliatory and even kind and likable. So this black student said he was going to run for president. Wallace had a great response to that. After this black man said he was going to run for president, this black student, he said, between you and me, we both might get rid of that crowd in Washington, and we might even run as a ticket. Now that's kind of interesting. Wallace, in this friendly exchange, said to Du Bois's grandson, hey, let's run together on a ticket. Obviously, Wallace was openly racist. I don't think meant any of this, but it just goes to show how kind of smart and conciliatory he was. And so he actually received rave reviews after his visit in Harvard and kind of felt like he had some fire in the belly. Now, of course, this was early November. Less than 3 weeks later, President John F. Kennedy is assassinated. Initially, Wallace strikes a very mild and very sensible tone.
Governor, do you have a statement to make on your arrival here at Washington?
Well, other than to say that I'm sure that I speak for all the people of Alabama when I say that we are deeply grieved and saddened by this taking of the life of the President of the United States. This has been truly an attack on the American system and on the American people, and it's truly a sad day, and we in Alabama are grieving about the loss of the President of the United States.
As a Southerner, I imagine you're proud to see a fellow Southerner now take the reins of office.
Well, I do not want to mention anything about politics because this matter transcends all political considerations at this time, and all I can say is it's a sad day.
But of course, with the death of John F. Kennedy, this changes everything. Initially, Wallace thought this would change everything for the worse. Now, all of a sudden, he'd be running against Lyndon Johnson, most likely, who would be running in the place of a slain president. To say that there'd be sentiment for Johnson in the primary election would be an understatement. And back then, if you were an incumbent, you wouldn't actually commit to running again, and you wouldn't actually put your name on the ballot. But what you would do if there was anybody else trying to run against you is that you would have a favorite son candidate, meaning if there was a popular politician in that state, that popular politician allied with you would run in your place and give your delegates, the delegates that they got from votes from people that voted for them, they would give those delegates to you. So Lyndon Johnson sat out the primary race for a little bit and had allied Governor John Reynolds run in his place. Reynolds did not put a lot of effort into this campaign whatsoever, and it was surprised that Wallace even made the ballot. But what happened is Wallace gave an impassioned speech at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where this famed publicist decided to put his own money and get a bunch of signatures to put George Wallace on the Wisconsin Democratic primary ballot. After seeing all this, Wallace was of course considering jumping in, and he saw the external support to get him on the ballot. Wallace famously said, "If I ran outside the South and got 10%, it would be a victory. It would shake their eye teeth in Washington." So Wallace had pretty low expectations. He figured he would just run to get a mere 10% of the vote. And even 10% meant that there'd still be hundreds of thousands of people supporting, despite all the establishment's efforts and all their power, would be supporting segregation and the policies that Wallace stood for. So he thought, why not? He decided to officially announce his candidacy for president in Wisconsin and visited the Surge Hall out in Milwaukee. And Wallace made a very, very smart play for certain Democratic voters. Initially, the press thought he would only be popular in the Deep South. Why would he be popular out in Chicago or Milwaukee? But what Wallace realized is that he could get a lot of the backlash from the white ethnic Northerners. And what I mean by white ethnic Northerners would be immigrants from Italy, from Poland, from Germany, from Ireland, not necessarily the WASP upper crust type white people. Those are already lost. Those are already lost and those people are already against segregation. But the recent immigrants, the recent white immigrants, felt like there was an encroachment on their land, on their rights. I obviously disagree with that, but that was the policy, especially since busing had been discussed, the Civil Rights Act was on the table. A lot of these places in the North that say they were integrated weren't actually truly integrated. They were just kind of more unofficially segregated in a lot of instances. So it's interesting. So Wallace went to this big banquet hall that was the home of the Polish community, and they kind of felt like they got pushed out. They were in southwest Milwaukee and felt that they got pushed out by the city center from black residents, so they were already quite mad. And Wallace felt that he could get their backlash. And interestingly enough, the term backlash was coined because of Wallace in his 1964 primary run. That was previously not an actual Merriam-Webster word, but one journalist said Wallace is poised to take advantage of white voters lashing back to all these civil rights bills, creating a backlash. And there, the term backlash was created entirely around this 1964 primary. So Wallace gave this rousing speech where thousands of people attended. And for once, unlike in the college, it was a completely friendly audience. He talked about his opposition to the Civil Rights Act, his opposition to busing, which was starting to come on the horizon. And he also talked about, interestingly enough, and this is also, you can compare it to other people, he talked about his opposition to communism, because of course many Eastern Europeans who are now living in Milwaukee and now living in northern states previously had escaped communistic countries. So Wallace, again, knew how to cater his message. The civil rights stuff was a part of it, certainly, but he really led with the anti-communist aspect of it, which got a lot of appeal. And in this bizarre sense of camaraderie in that banquet hall, the audience broke into song and started singing Dixie in Polish. This is not orchestrated by the Wallace campaign. That got a lot of good press, and in subsequent appearances, Wallace began to deeply orchestrate things to get even more press and even more attention, because of course he was running this uphill battle. One of the things he did is he would get his campaign team to find an African-American gentleman and pay them to be a fake stooge, to show up at the Wallace event, start screaming, wave signs in protest, and then have the Wallace team or supporters of Wallace throw him out, which of course would get press. Now the reality is that person visiting could care less, and he was just happy to get paid by the Wallace campaign. But it seemed like, oh, look at this controversy. This controversial candidate is causing each and every one of his stops. So again, kind of just like Trump, he was a master of the stage. In the end, Wallace didn't do too bad at all. He got 34% to Johnson's 66%. Signaling that there was actually some worrisome momentum for the segregationist governor.
The greatest vote I got in Milwaukee was in the Polish-American, Serbian-American district of that city, because they don't believe what these left-wing papers say themselves.
Next up was the Indiana primary, where Wallace certainly felt like he was in friendly terrain. Keep in mind, even more so in Indiana, there had been a lot of white backlash from so-called ethnic whites who felt that they were being pushed out by black citizens because of the Great Migration. This time around, Governor Matthew Welsh decided to campaign in Johnson's place. But Welsh did not take anything for granted. He actually campaigned across the state of Indiana and worked furiously to try to deny Wallace a certain victory. The alarms were sounded, and notable people like Milton Eisenhower and Ted Kennedy even spoke in Indiana in favor of Welsh in opposition to George Wallace and his candidacy. But Wallace, in the wake of his stand at the University of Alabama, coined a new term, federal encroachment. That way, he could frame civil rights in a supposedly non-racist argument, although obviously any opposition to civil rights is racist on its face. But that was the argument of Wallace that he was making to the North, that he kind of fine-tuned in Indiana, fine-tuned to all these Polish and all these formerly Eastern Europeans, that there was simply too much of a federal government encroachment onto the states, that it wasn't a direct opposition of civil rights necessarily, but it was a direct opposition to unelected judges. Does that sound familiar? I bet it does. Or federal decrees. Those are the two things he was railing about. It was about big government versus states' rights. And it's interesting to kind of learn that the more things change, the more they really do stay the same. So Wallace came barnstorming into Indiana. His first stop, Notre Dame University. That was not necessarily a successful visit. While over 5,000 people attended, about half of them attended to protest Wallace and his opposition to civil rights. They even broke out into song singing "We Shall Overcome," drowning out any audio people could hear of Wallace's speech. He ducked out and left mid-speech. But at Ball State University, he had a much more friendly audience.
I don't think personalities are the issue. The issues are really the issue. And if I am as evil as they say I am, and the Civil Rights Bill is as good as they say it is, one confrontation before statewide television and radio to the intelligent people of Indiana would have made this very apparent. So I can't see why those who are always talking about what a good piece of legislation the so-called Civil Rights Bill is would mind debating this issue with an evil person such as myself. I'll try to stay off of controversial subjects, but everybody that I have seen in this state are intelligent, whichever you want to say, are intelligent people, and that's all that I recommend. This Civil Rights Bill turns your school system over to the federal government, and I'm not for that. I believe that you in this state should run your schools. So this matter of the so-called Civil Rights Bill is an attack upon the property system in our country. You know, we hear all of these pickets and left-wingers and people have a right to picket. Let me tell you this, I have no objection to peaceful picketing. That's a part of the American heritage and the American system. But you know, when they talk about human rights above property rights, you know, that sounds good, but let's just analyze it a moment. The only countries in the world where anybody has any human rights are in those nations where the ownership of private property is sacred under the law, such as in this country. Now, you know, all property has been taken in Russia and in China for the use of the public and the satellite countries. All private property has been taken for the public use, such as the Civil Rights Bill would take your father's business and use it for the public use. Yet there are no human rights in Russia and China, not a single one, and you know it. And the only places where you have human rights are in those nations that guarantee the ownership of private property. I have no objection to the federal government carrying on its functions of government. I am for the federal government. Nobody's against the federal government. Nobody came to its defense any quicker than the people of Alabama during every war in which we have fought, except one, and that was 100 years ago. But of course, and they will do so again. But we do not think that when the federal government helps a program in Alabama, that gives them a license to change the local traditions and customs of our people. Why should you take, and we paid nearly $1 billion in income taxes last year. Now, you know, the last young fellow who asked me that question, he had some figures that showed we got $239 million back last year in Alabama, and yet our income taxes we paid last year were nearly $900 million. So I don't know whose figures you're talking about, but if we didn't take some of the money back that they take away from us down there in Washington, of course we couldn't operate a lot of things. Sure, federal taxes are high. You ask your fathers and mothers about income taxes. Why, the states can't get enough money to run the functions of government they ought to because of the high taxes. But that's no reason when they send you some money that they ought to tell you, we want to pass a law that tells you you can't sell your home to somebody that you want to. And I hope God blesses everybody, regardless of his race, color, creed, or nationality. Well, I'm surprised at the reception we got. Sure, yeah.
Welsh was certainly active in his campaign, and it showed. People were worried that Wallace would get over 40%, which would keep his momentum into the rest of the primaries and even quite possibly give him the nomination. But Wallace only broke 30%, and that was considered in Indiana to be a disappointment. Interestingly enough, the biggest percentage that Wallace got, the city that was most supportive of him, was Gary, Indiana. Now, Gary, Indiana, of course, with the Jackson 5 and everything like that, is a historically black city, and at that point it was just dramatically turning black. So that was a perfect city, and Wallace campaigned in that city vigorously and won, I believe, about 80% of the vote of the Democratic primary electorate. But now was the final stand, Maryland. Again, Wallace had to get under 30% to really not be an embarrassment for the rest of the Democratic Party establishment. Initially, Governor J. Millard Tawes was going to run in Johnson's place. But interestingly enough, Tawes was too supportive of civil rights. In fact, he had been quite the trailblazer and enacted the first anti-housing discriminatory bill in the United States, as well as the first active anti-segregation bill across in the U.S. So Tawes was a pioneer on civil rights issues and enacted a lot of the future federal civil rights bills into his state of Maryland. Because of that, they thought his support of civil rights, he'd be a candidate that would be too on the nose and even too liberal. So junior Senator Daniel Brewster, a much younger guy, a little more charismatic, decided to take his place. Brewster took the campaign seriously, and he was also supportive of civil rights. But because he had been in office for such a short amount of time, nobody knew of his internal support. Proved himself to be an actual presidential passionate candidate. He released a video statewide with certain screenshots and certain instances of Wallace's evil. And he really highlighted the difference between him and Wallace and sort of unabashedly decided that he would support the civil rights efforts. This is a watershed moment for Democratic politicians in America.
I have entered this primary to give the Democratic voters of Maryland a clear choice to vote either for the forces of anarchy or for the forces of law, order, and decency. Wallace says, I'm not a racist. Here's the truth. Now let me quote to you from his inauguration address in January of 1963. And I quote him, I say, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. If that is not the speech of a violent and mean man, then I've never heard one. Here is the bombing that snuffed out the lives of 4 little girls while they attended Sunday school and caused thousands of heartaches and tarnished the name of our country. Is this law and order? Do we want this in Maryland? The governor of Alabama is very careful to tell you what he is against, but not what he is for. He is destructive, not responsible, not constructive. The true issue is the dignity of the Democratic Party. We don't want Maryland to be the scene of senseless bombings and riotings. We know that the moment those in authority dare to defy the law, they are preaching mob rule. We are against bombings. We are against rioting. We are against bigotry and hypocrisy. We believe in a square deal for all Americans and in the principles of law, order, and decency. The governor of Alabama is campaigning on a platform of deceit and duplicity and hate. All Democrats have a duty to vote in the presidential primary. You should support the President of the United States and the principles of law, order, and decency.
Vote for Daniel B. Brewster. Vote against bias, bigotry, and intolerance.
He was campaigning in Baltimore and the D.C. suburbs in a lot of the population clusters. Meanwhile, Wallace decided to tack to the rural area. He was looking at the Eastern Shore, and interestingly enough, I lived in the Eastern Shore for about 3 months. I worked for a TV news organization there. And the Eastern Shore of Maryland is this kind of rural peninsula that sticks out from the rest of the United States. And it really does feel like the South. You go just 45 minutes outside to D.C. or Baltimore, and you feel like you're in the Northeast. But in that little section, there's no big city. The biggest city is Salisbury, which has about 30,000 people. And even to this day, there are a lot of white rural residents. So Wallace felt like he would campaign in that neck of the woods, while Brewster campaigned in Baltimore and the D.C. suburbs. In the year prior, in 1963, a riot had broken out in Cambridge, Maryland, in the Eastern Shore, over non-enforcement of the Equal Rights Act. Wallace felt like this is a perfect area to campaign in. Because in Cambridge, there were a number of black residents, yes, but there were a number of rural white residents as well, who felt very connected to the Confederacy and very connected in their opposition to civil rights. But there was something being awoken inside within the residents of the Eastern Shore. They had been distributed pamphlets by, if you could believe it, the National States' Rights Party, which actually described themselves as neo-Nazi. They said Wallace was the last chance for the white voter. And it was so scary that the Baltimore Sun even threatened that Wallace would win the state. And, quote, if Wallace wins Maryland, he could win the Democratic nomination. For a moment in time, for about 1 week, maybe 2, it looked like it could be a 50-50 chance that George Wallace would be the Democratic standard bearer in 1964. Everything hinged on Maryland. So, final showdown. Wallace snags an impressive 43% to Brewster's 57%. But that's right, Brewster still ended up with an impressive victory. Still, 43% was the best percentage that Wallace had gotten to date. And in the Eastern Shore, he got 90% of the Democratic primary votes. Wallace said, I would have won them all if it weren't for that block. And you could fill in the N-bomb blank, obviously. So you could see that Wallace's views on civil rights were deeply held and internalized. It wasn't just for show. After that, Wallace had a decision to make. There were only 2 primaries left. He probably couldn't get the nomination. Perhaps if he had won all the subsequent primaries and Maryland, the delegates might have very well folded and gone towards Wallace. If that was the will of the primary voters, then that's the will of the primary voters. But luckily, he was defeated. He had a decision to make as to whether or not to forge on as a symbolic candidate or to pack it in with so few primaries left. And on an interview with Face the Nation, Wallace decided to pack it in. There was some talk that Wallace, in 1964, he was considering this, would run as a third-party candidate. He was looking at the nomination battle between Barry Goldwater and Nelson Rockefeller. But once Barry Goldwater actually won, those in opposition to civil rights felt like Goldwater was sufficiently with them, unlike Nelson Rockefeller, who had built a career as a governor of New York, being very progressive and instilling one of the first anti-segregation laws in America. George Wallace even wanted to be Barry Goldwater's running mate. That was actually a conversation the two had for some weeks. Ultimately, Goldwater decided against it, feeling that it would be too controversial. With that, Wallace was free to remain within the Democratic Party or go out of it independent. And this, of course, lay the seeds for his famous independent 1968 run. He had become famous and well known and had the Democratic Party establishment shaking in its boots. This little-known governor from Alabama, who had merely been in office for less than a year by the time he started campaigning, almost threw off the President of the United States in the wake of the assassination of the previous one. Not an easy feat. What Wallace also did is he gave voters permission to be openly racist and openly anti-civil rights in a time previously where they couldn't necessarily vocalize it as comfortably and reflexively as they were able to after Wallace started echoing their sentiments. And Wallace was really, in 1964, the first anti-establishment candidate. Yes, there was Theodore Roosevelt and Bob La Follette in 1912, but in terms of the latter half of the century and the 21st century, Wallace set the narrative. Wallace created that anti-establishment language that no other candidate had really implemented before. His opposition against Supreme Court justice appointments, his opposition against federal decrees, saying it was an us versus them battle, and his advocacy for states' rights was the blueprint for any anti-establishment candidate running in the future. And Wallace's fun jokes, as you can see here, and kind of cartoonish, fun way of presenting, much like Donald Trump, again, created that blueprint that a candidate could be more human and less formal. And in their lack of formality, they could actually be trusted and could be taken more seriously. And not only that, but what they were saying, for some reason, seemed to be more relatable and more palatable because of the way it was presented. Wallace was a master of this. So, whether you love Trump or hate him, you have to think George Wallace. There would be no Donald Trump. I'm not talking about the policy. That's a different conversation for another day. But I'm talking about the general themes, the style of presentation, the way you deal with protesters, the way you deal with the audience, the way you communicate with them, the way you kind of punch back at the press. All started by Wallace, all started in his 1964 campaign. So thank you guys for watching. You might notice some anachronistic clothing. I love history, and I'm also a big fan of the 50s, so I have a closet full of clothes from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, but many of them from the 50s, early 60s. So this is a shirt from 1962. This sweater is from 63. So my clothes will always be accurate. If I'm presenting something historic, the clothes will actually be from that year in or around. And not only that, but the video and the footage will always be accurate. So there's only some I could find from 1964. It's kind of an obscure primary, but found enough.